Developing right now back on the East Coast. Court just wrapped up on day one of the latest pre-trial military hearings for accused WikiLeaker Bradley Manning. His defense asking the judge to dismiss all charges against him on grounds prosecutors are deliberately withholding key evidence. Private First Class Manning is facing nearly 24 charges, including aiding the enemy. He's been held behind bars for 660 days now, in solitary confinement at times for 23 hours per day. A UN investigator this week deeming his treatment both cruel and inhumane. Those comments likely to further fuel the firestorm surrounding the military's handling of the 24-year-old, who's accused of downloading to WikiLeaks some 500,000 sensitive battlefield documents. If convicted, Manning faces life in prison. Back with us now exclusively is David House, a friend of Manning's. He hasn't seen him for nearly a year, but had eyes and ears inside the courtroom today. Welcome, David. What did you hear? What are you hearing about what actually happened in court today?
So from the reports I'm getting, it looks like Bradley Manning's attorney, David Coombs, filed a motion today to dismiss all charges against Manning with prejudice on the basis that the government prosecution is not providing the defense with documents that are critical to the defense's arguments in court. Of course, the U.S. government is once again saying that evidence that may be used by Bradley Manning's attorney in court in order to defend him are classified and therefore cannot be given to the defense. This is a report from court today. This is consistent with David Coombs' earlier pointing out last December in Bradley Manning's Article 32 hearing that there was a conflict of interest in the presiding officer in that court. So it seems the U.S. government in this trial has been throwing stumbling blocks in the way of Bradley Manning's defense the whole time. Hopefully this will change and he can have a fair trial soon.
Do you have any sense of where the decision on that kind of stuff is going to head? Is there any indication from your sources?
You know, it's really hard to say. The U.S. government has a history of using things like State Secrets Act in order to stop, for example, the NSA warrantless wiretapping stuff that happened in 2005. So this is something that has actually some kind of validity, I guess, at least in the media, the way people perceive it. Right now, unless there's a public outcry from the U.S. people that says, no, you cannot have a man being brought up on espionage charges and refuse to give his defense evidence, then I'm not sure he may not see a fair trial. And this is it's an issue that does require a lot of public knowledge and public support if Bradley does really hope to have a fair shot at getting his due process.
Now, the other big development just this week is this UN report by the investigator who looks into torture stuff. I just want to read one quote that this is from Juan Mendez, the UN torture chief. He says, imposing seriously punitive conditions of detention on someone who's not been found guilty of any crime is a violation of his right to physical and psychological integrity, as well as of his presumption of innocence. What do you make of the UN report and what its impact will be?
Well, the UN report was very vindicating, first of all, to the activists this past year who have been calling for Manning's conditions to be changed. I imagine it's also very vindicating to P.J. Crowley, the U.S. State Department spokesperson who was forced to resign after saying that Bradley Manning's conditions were ridiculous, counterproductive, and stupid. This recent report by the UN, finding that the U.S. government and the Obama administration have violated the United Nations Conventions on Torture in their treatment of Manning, is in line also with the Human Rights Watch report and the Amnesty International report last year saying exactly the same thing. In some ways, you could say that this Bradley Manning incident kind of embodies the failures of the Obama administration. And what we have is an administration who came into office promising transparency and promising an end to torture. And instead, we've seen the most prosecutions of whistleblowers of any president in U.S. history, as well as seeing the torture, judging by the UN, of a whistleblower here on U.S. soil. This sounds like the kind of thing that would happen in China. And as a young man and a political activist, I'm very worried by these developments.
Now, does the UN report have any standing formally in this military tribunal? Is there a chance it has any impact, or is it just part of the atmospherics now at this point around the trial?
My understanding is that the United Nations will not have sway over what happens in this trial. However, the members of this trial, the people actually in the jury, the upcoming jury, I think should really consider what's been going on the last 2 years. In the WikiLeaks Manning investigation, We've seen the torture of an alleged whistleblower. We've had State Department officials come out and say this man is being tortured and this is ridiculous. We've had activists that were unfairly targeted by the U.S. government have their computers seized, myself included. We've seen Bradley Manning suffering physical and emotional trauma through his treatment in Quantico. And now, from the defense attorney, we're hearing that stumbling blocks are being thrown in the way of any kind of defense effort trying to be mounted for Bradley Manning. In my mind, this is very similar to the Ellsberg incident that happened in the 1960s, 70s with Richard Nixon, mistreating Ellsberg, using his plumbers to go and actually go into Ellsberg's office and look at psychiatric reports. Of course, the case against Ellsberg, another whistleblower, was dismissed based on the government's wrongdoing. At this point, I think the U.S. government should just drop the charade and drop the charges against Manning.
Now, what would you say to people who are outraged by his treatment? What should they actually do if they want to protest that in some way that's tangible?
It's hard to say right now. The question is, how do we actually impact our politicians? How do we make them know when we have an issue we really care about? Unfortunately, nowadays, the normal methods of just writing them a letter or sending them an email or giving them a phone call may not actually work. And the reason for that is that in the revelations from WikiLeaks, there were many political careers that were scuttled, many career politicians who are now very upset at whistleblowing in general and want to clamp down upon it, want to stop it for good. So in this particular circumstance, I'm not really sure how you convince politicians that opening government up and that protecting whistleblowers and that not torturing them is a good idea. It looks like this is a battle that people are going to have to fight in some other way, and I'm not sure anyone's really been able to articulate how exactly to do that yet.
Now, what do you say? There are critics of Manning who put aside his the obviously inhumane and cruel treatment that the UN is calling out. What's your reply to critics who would say, putting the treatment aside, what he did was wrong and put at risk and exposed to potential, being killed, lots of sources of U.S. intelligence, lots of sensitive information about military operations, and that was fundamentally wrong, even if it's also wrong the way he's being treated in this murky military pretrial phase?
It's a good thing you ask, because one document that is in contention the defense would like access to and cannot get access to is the WikiLeaks Impact Report. And this report was compiled by the WikiLeaks task force set up by the U.S. government to deal with these revelations that came out in the press 2 years ago. The WikiLeaks task force findings were leaked to, I believe it was NBC last summer, who published an article going through the task force, going through the impact report, and summarizing it. In a sense, there being no national security problems in the WikiLeaks releases, there being no people actually that were targeted as a result of the WikiLeaks releases, and a large part of the furor on Capitol Hill in trying to actually prosecute Bradley Manning and shut down WikiLeaks being due to people's own political aspirations being inhibited by having all this information from the U.S. government suddenly go into the hands of the people. So if the WikiLeaks impact assessment actually said, the government's own report says that these things were not indeed happening, it makes me wonder where this propaganda is coming from. Personally, I think all these marketing firms working for federal security contractors and the U.S. government are just spinning out these talking points about it being a national security issue, when you come right down to it, not a single person has been injured, and this is NATO talking, in Kabul or in Iraq based on the releases of these documents. And in exchange, we've had more news and revelations about the deceptive practices of both parties in Washington in the last 2 years than we've ever seen. So in my mind, I think those critics should consider the source of their information and should really study more about the WikiLeaks impact assessment. You can find it online.
Just a couple seconds, David. What message do you want the world to hear right now on behalf of your friend and where this is headed?
We live in very, very difficult times right now. The U.S. government has, for the last decade at least, been building this larger and larger federal presence, which may actually threaten our liberty and our national security more than any other threat we may face. I think that if we allow the U.S. government to imprison whistleblowers, if we allow them to torture whistleblowers in a way that we would expect China maybe to be guilty of, then we are no better as a Western democracy than any other country on the planet. Now, I'm a God-fearing American, I'm an Eagle Scout, and I know we live in a better country than that. I know we live in an honorable country. And every American should start thinking about what our real American values are and think that protecting whistleblowers is definitely one of them.
David House, loyal friend and a very eloquent advocate on behalf of his friend Bradley Manning. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and perspectives on this today.
Thanks for having me, Matt.